We're live, Senate Appropriations, February 7th. We're going through FY26 budget proposals. And before us today is the Vermont State College system. Thank you for coming in. We will introduce ourselves if you're not familiar with everybody on the committee. Senator Bruce from County coming in probably shortly.
Pat Brennan from Dial County, Colchester.
Senator Lyons should come in shortly from Chittenden, Southeast. Andrew Perchlick, Washington District.
Bob Norris, Franklin County, and the town of Elbert in Grand Isle County.
And Wattsville, Washington District. Very nice.
If you want to introduce yourself for the record and the others that you have with you.
Sure. Well, thank you. For the record, I'm Beth Mauk. I'm the Chancellor of the Vermont State Colleges System. And I have here with me Sharon Scott, who is the Chief Financial and Operating Officer of the Vermont State Colleges Systems. And I think what we'd like to do today is I'll just go with a smaller review of the Vermont State Colleges System, and then I'll have Sharon jump in on our budget requests.
Okay.
So the Vermont State Colleges System actually consists of two institutions. It is the Community College of Vermont and Vermont State University. And what we have centers and campuses all around the state and in every one of our rural areas. We have campuses and centers anywhere from Bennington to Montpelier to Linden to St. Albans and everywhere in between. And we have about 850 employees who really do make up the heart and soul of these rural communities. And we're very proud of everything that they do. You may be asking, what is a chancellor? So I get that question a lot. Not from my brother, who thinks it was very close to the guy from Star Wars. Palpatine, I think.
Exactly.
He was a chancellor before he was.
Right.
Trust me, not the same.
Yeah. I assume you're much nicer.
So my role really is to act as really like the CEO of a corporation with different divisions, in this case, two institutions, the Community College of Vermont and Vermont State University. And really what I do is align the needs and goals of both institutions so that we ensure that we are really helping to move Vermont along. We make sure that we are maximizing resources and creating programming that will allow students to traverse our entire system. Without a chancellor, we would really lose the opportunity to be very strategic in thinking about where we're deploying our resources and how we can do so in the best way. And one of the things is, you may be wondering is, so how has the Vermont State Colleges helped Vermont even in these last couple of years? One of the things we did was answer the call when there was when we needed an increase in the number of nurses in the state. And this year alone, we graduated 500 nurses. Over 90% of them were Vermonters or took the exam in Vermont, and so we know they'll stay in Vermont. And so now when we know that our healthcare system is so in need of personnel, we were able to get nurses at really every level of the spectrum because we have stackable credentials starting at CCV and heading to Vermont State University. In addition, I think we all remember the floods of the past few years. There were many small businesses impacted by those floods, and what we were able to do is deploy our small business center to ensure that those small businesses had resources available to them to understand how to navigate some of the challenges that they were going through. And we've just been so proud to be able to do all of that. Now, the Vermont State Colleges System was established by the legislature for the benefit of Vermont. And what that means is that we believe that every Vermonter, regardless of their income or location, should have access to high quality higher education. And we know that we have to continually be changing so that we are meeting the needs of the workforce so that we can grow Vermont's economy and be able to prepare students at every age for today's opportunities so that they can have the great jobs that they are looking for. Now, it wasn't many years ago that the system found itself in dire financial straits. We had about 8 days of cash on hand just as the pandemic was coming. And frankly, through all of that, the legislature came in, really assisted us with some funding, but also had a select committee on the state of public higher education, which really helped us to have a roadmap in order to get back to sustainability. And one of the things we really realized through that process was the fact that the system as it was structurally not going to be viable for many years. And so what we have been doing, frankly, is making the necessary changes so that we're able to continue to meet the needs of Vermonters. Now, one of the things that we've been able to do is really rethink how we serve Vermonters, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But we really are turning the corner. I'm very happy today to sit here and say that we have a lot of very positive news and a lot of really positive outcomes from what we've been working on the last few days. And this partnership that we have with the legislature really has been for the long haul. The legislature has really walked side by side with us as we have made these changes. On a personal level, I'm very excited to be here and frankly honored and humbled to be the chancellor of the Vermont State Colleges system. Every day I get to meet students and faculty and staff who are excited about the jobs that they're in or the programs that they're able to attend. And I think that we're all working together to ensure that we continue on that trajectory. So how is state investment driving change? And as I talk about this, I think really what we need to understand is, what does a college student look like and what do they need today? So nationally, we know that most students are part-time and the average age of a part-time student is 27. In addition, these students, because they are now older, are really looking for opportunities where college becomes part of their life, that they don't go off to college and then come back to it. They want college to be ingrained in the life that they have. And so we've had to make changes. But the other thing that we know is that most students are very concerned about how it is they're going to pay for a college education. And they're not worried about the college debt that they may have 10 years from now. They're trying to figure out, how am I going to pay for next semester's tuition? And so these three pieces, their age, their need for flexibility, and their concern about finances, really will be what drives us as we're making our changes in the future. So what are some things we've already done? Right now, students, because we're able to leverage the power of our system, students can take courses at any campus or any center. If they are either a Vermont State University student or a CCV student, they're able to take courses online or in a hybrid manner, which is very exciting. Just recently, I was in a faculty member's class. He had students in the class and then students up on a Zoom link, and they were interacting. And one of the students said to me, you know, I actually normally am usually in class. I'm sorry I missed you today, but I'm sick and I didn't feel comfortable coming to the class. So he was able to very quickly transition from one modality to the next. The students are, we are looking, because they're looking for more online, we are really beefing up our online capabilities in the number of online offerings we're able to make. But in addition, we're also beefing up our number of online programs that we are creating. The last couple of years, we actually cut the tuition for Vermont State University, and the Community College of Vermont has been the recipient of a number of very important programs. One, the 802 Opportunity Grant, which allows any Vermonter whose family is making $75,000 or less to come to CCV for free. A few statistics on that, just so you can see. I sort of gave you national numbers a few minutes ago. On our local level, those 802 Opportunity Grants, 69% of the students are 25 or older, and then 73 of those students are the first in their family to go to college. And so again, these are the kinds of demographics. We're seeing them nationally. We're also seeing them right here in Vermont. And we've also been able to develop career-aligned programs. The nursing program I was just talking about is a really good example of how we're meeting the needs of Vermont by looking at programs and seeing how we can put them into place so that the most students possible can participate in those. We are really in this for viability and long-term sustainability. And again, I just want to thank all of you for everything that you have done to ensure that this system remains very vibrant and vital. Also, I told you I have a lot of good news. I have actually great news on enrollment and workforce impact. So last year, we graduated 2,000 students. 10,000 students were degree seeking over that year, and another 7,000 were in workforce programs, and 80% of those students were Vermonters. In addition, Vermont State University, which, as you know, has undergone a lot of transformation in the last few years, had a 14% increase in new students. And we're seeing very strong enrollment numbers in probably double digits again for fall of 25. It's still early, but we, do watch these things. So, I do have a vision for the future. I'm calling it VSC Vision 2030. So as a reminder, the Vermont State Colleges system was founded for the benefit of Vermont. And we know that that means that every Vermonter should have access to high quality higher education, regardless of their income or location. And as I said, we're developing workforce programs to grow Vermont's economy and also ensure that we are there for students at every age so that they can have great jobs. So what is the vision for this institution? I've already sort of talked a little bit about it, but just so you can see some of the things we'll be working on. We do have an online growth vision. We are seeing tremendous demand in our online programs. So looking at increasing offerings, but also ensuring that we have the kind of digital infrastructure that will be necessary that will meet the needs of our students now and in the future. Seamless transfer pathways will be so important. We know that if students are wanting to have a job or have a life even and a college career at the same time, they will need to be able to come in and out of our system, making seamless pathways so important so that they can start a CCV and maybe get a certificate and move up maybe to VTSU and get either an associate's or a bachelor's or some other combination that makes sense to them. We need to focus on apprenticeship education. And what I mean by that is earning while you learn. Students are going to have to be able to have a job and be learning from the hands-on practical component of that at the same time that they're making some classroom, getting classroom experience. And lastly, we need to have a housing transformation. If our students are older and they need more flexibility, what they also need is housing. We know housing is so important in Vermont. And so looking at potentially having, we're looking at options for apartment style housing where students can live 12 months out of the year. If they're older, they want to be ingrained in the communities. We know that they would like this, and what our housing will be able to do is ensure that those students have an opportunity to have housing year round and be really ingrained in the communities that they're in. I suppose my biggest point here is that our future will not look like our past. What will happen is we will be doing more online offerings, looking at apprenticeships and seamless pathways and some housing transformation so that we are meeting the needs continually of the students of today and into the future. So I'll say thank you for my part of it, and now I can pass it off to Sharon unless any of you have questions for me now.
Yeah, go ahead with the budget part.
Great. So for the record, my name is Sharon Zagash. I'm the Chief Financial and Operating Officer of the Vermont State Colleges. I've been with the system since 2003, and I've held this role since shortly after the pandemic began. And so I've been sitting in this chair, coming to you, asking to support us for these last 4.5 years. I have very deep roots here in Vermont. I'm a native Vermonter. I'm the daughter of a milkman. I'm a first-generation college student. And I say all those things because higher education is not only something that I work at, it is a passion, because I've seen not only for our students, but for myself, how higher education transforms lives. And what we do every day absolutely transforms lives. And as Chancellor Mauck noted, at the beginning of the pandemic, it was a very dire situation for the Vermont State Colleges. We had about 8 days of cash on hand, and there was a real concern about our ability to be able to make payroll. It was a very, very dark time, and it was a dark time for many people. But under the leadership of Senators Kitchell and Baruth and this committee and the entirety of the legislature, a new path forward was identified. That path, created with the guidance of the Select Committee on the Future of Public Higher Education, required that the VSC take action to create a financially sustainable future. And that's what we've been working on ever since. To do so, you asked us to reduce our structural deficit over 5 years through actions that were both challenging but also necessary. And in exchange, you agreed to increase our base appropriation and provide the bridge funding necessary to help us operate while we continue to transform and make these incredibly necessary adjustments. I'm extremely proud of what we accomplished in this time. We've lowered our expenses, we've built up our reserves so that we can weather a rainy day, and we've developed a bright future. The legislature has been incredibly supportive of us and a tremendous partner throughout this process. And while we aren't out of the woods yet, I can see the edge, and that's really exciting. And for those of you who have seen me for the last 4 years, those are words I have never said before. So I'm very excited to be able to say that. So quite literally, we would not be here without you, and I'm deeply appreciative.
Ms. Scott, can you remind me that that was a 5-year plan?
It's a 5-year plan.
And what year are we in now?
So we are requesting the 5th year of bridge funding, and so by 2027 we will be balanced. So
Great, so we're on track.
we are on track.
Okay, great.
And that's why I say I can see the edge.
Yeah.
And for those of you who hike, the edge is a long ways away, but we can see it, which is really exciting. So I wanted to just take a quick moment to give you a little bit of an overview of the VSC budget. And in FY20, during the pandemic, our base appropriation was $30.5 million, and it was equivalent to about 17% of our total revenues. For FY25, the VSC is receiving $50.9 million in its base appropriation, and that's equivalent to about 26% of our total revenues. This increase, which was outlined in the Select Committee's report, was an essential building block to financial sustainability. The funds are used to support both the Community College of Vermont and Vermont State University's ongoing operations, as well as it also directly supports the Vermont Manufacturing Extension Center. Without these funds, these institutions would not be able to offer statewide rural higher education around the state, which is so incredibly important to our communities. Unsurprisingly, the vast majority of our expenses go to the most important asset that we have, which is our people, our faculty, and our staff. Last year, 57% of all payments were out of our expense budget were made to faculty and staff and on their wages and their benefits. Now, this is down from FY20, which at that time it was 63% of our total expenses. And the difference is actually $11 million. And that's 9% less than what we were spending in FY20. That is a really hard number to look at when you figure that we also had mandatory wage increases and benefits increases during that time. This work has not been easy, but it has been worth it. And I'm very proud of what our faculty and staff have been able to accomplish these last few years. Every day, they make us a success, and we're really proud of them. So I want to just give a little bit of an overview of our request. During the last legislative session in Act 113, the legislature decreased the system's required structural deficit reduction from $25 million over 5 years to $22 million. With this change, the legislature increased the VSC's FY25 appropriation by $1.5 million over and above the normal increase that was regularly anticipated. And that was the first installment to address this $3 million change in structural deficit reduction. So with that in mind, the VSC is requesting a 3% increase in its base consistent with the governor's recommendation, plus $1.5 million. That additional $1.5 million is necessary to allow the VSC to continue to align with this new $22 million structural deficit reduction requirement that was outlined in Act 113. And we're also requesting $5 million in bridge funding, which is consistent with what we've been requesting in the past. So this past year for FY25, we received $10 million in bridge funding. This is the planned step down to $5 million. So as shown here, the governor has recommended $52.5 million in general fund appropriation, plus $5 million in bridge funding and $1 million in funding for CCV's Tuition Advantage program. I do want to mention that over the last several years, the Vermont State College's students have been incredibly fortunate to receive critical occupation scholarships that have funded scholarships in our health professions, in early childhood education, and in a variety of fields that were absolutely vital to our ability to be able to succeed. Those free last dollar tuition programs allowed us to do some of the things that Chancellor Mauck has noted which is that we were able to increase the number of nurses that were coming through. Those scholarships sadly have run out effective with the end of this past fall, and they are not included in this budget request.
And can I ask why ESC didn't ask for the CC Advantage $1 million?
So the Tuition Advantage program is a really great program, and it's very beneficial. But there are also other programs that are available. And so in terms of looking at funding options for the VSC as a whole, we felt that a base appropriation, particularly since we were asking for the 1.5 million, was probably where we needed to go.
You just basically rather have it in the base appropriation than dedicated to the tuition
Yes.
scholarships.
However, we're very grateful that the governor is considering it and that he had made that recommendation. So our last item is just on capital budget, and I'm not sure if you want us to go over that particular request or if you would
Are
like
you
to move
making
on.
this, the capital request in the capital bill?
Yes. Would you like us to go over it?
I mean, I guess real quick, yeah.
Okay.
Just real.
So in general, we are making a request for $21.5 million in capital funds. And that is to support our statewide major maintenance efforts, a renovation to the Jeffers Hall at Castleton campus, and the central heating plant replacement at the Johnson campus. These projects are focused on life, safety, and property preservation. And they really drive at the heart of who we are. And it's keeping our students safe and warm and healthy and our buildings in sound condition. Now, we also recognize that we need to put our own funds into these things. This past year, we self-funded about $2.5 million in major maintenance efforts. We also added $600,000 to a separate project that was related to deferred maintenance. And we also sought and received congressionally designated funding in excess of $12 million to support capital infrastructure, renovations to support expansion of our nursing programs and our dental hygiene programs, which means we're not coming to you asking for those because we recognize how tight the capital budget is. So as shown here, the governor has recommended $3 million for major maintenance and $5 million for the Johnson campus heating plant for a total of $8 million. And we know that you have a lot of challenges ahead of you.
Did the governor recommend $5 million knowing it was $8 million, or did you think it was actually going to, or the administration did think it was actually going to cost it?
So our request was $8 million.
And they said, we'll just build it at $5 million, or this maybe will be a payment for a future renovation?
I'm not sure.
We don't know.
I don't know. It's
You know
a
what-
recommendation.
You know what the heating plant is now, what the fuel is?
It's number 2 fuel.
You know what you want to convert to?
So the way that it's proposed as a project, in order to keep the cost down, we recommended replacing like for like. However, during the planning and design phase, we would evaluate alternative fuel sources and see if we could do it inside of the budget available to us. At the same time, also exploring alternative funding, like looking at what Efficiency Vermont may be able to do were we to use an alternative fuel other than number 2.
Okay, yes. Do you have a question?
Nope, just have strong opinions about that.
Yeah, likewise.
As we wait, we all have, as we wait, as we wait, sadly.
No,
you would-
support you in getting off of number 2. So
Yes.
just
Well, you
Yes.
also identify some savings by doing that.
Yes, so
Right.
the heating
Instead
plant,
of payout.
the heating plant itself is it's a little more than 60 years old. Even conversion to number 2 fossil, which is not our preferred technique, and converting it to a modern system would allow it to burn much more efficiently than what it does today. But we recognize that we would need to look at other alternatives. Our rough estimate is at least 50% higher to replace, because we would have to build another building and do some other things differently. But looking at it is absolutely important.
And so what, if you got only $5 million, but it costs $8 million, what would you do? Would you just wait another year?
We could do the planning and design work, we could do the prep work, and we could assess whether we can make another ask for a future biennium. The way that we've proposed it is that in the first year of the biennium, we would do the planning and design work with construction scheduled for year 2. If we did not receive all of the funding and we were unable to receive enough rebate funding or other source funding from things like Efficiency Vermont, we would make an additional request, and also seek to see if there are any internal funds that we could put towards this. That being said, our deferred maintenance profile is extraordinarily
Sure.
large, so we have lots of needs, and we would likely delay it.
Is this a picture of Jefferson or the?
That actually
Jefferson
is the
Hall?
Linden
This
campus,
is the Linden.
and you're facing across their Veterans Pond towards Vale Hall.
Did you have?
I guess I do have a question. So it sounds like the alternative, getting off number 2 is sort of plan B. Plan A is like for like.
Plan A is like for like due to cost restrictions.
If you got another $3 million, they might. You're on.
Well, that's really my question. It like, how much would it take to make plan B plan A?
So our rough estimate for Plan B to be Plan A, which is truly in our,
Yeah, no, I
is
understand.
truly our Plan
I
A.
support you.
So to be clear,
Yeah,
it
yeah.
would be our Plan A. Our initial rough estimates were, it was approximately $15 million because of the site location for where the central plant is located
Mhm.
at Johnson and the work that we would need to do to make that happen. So that is certainly something that we could look at.
And any like feasibility work, I thought I heard you say that if you could do the feasibility to look at alternatives within the budget, you would do that. But, so what is the potential additional costs of alternative, even just considering the resources needed to look at alternatives, to do feasibility for alternatives, and do you have any estimates for that?
So we had made a request of 1.6 million for year 1 for planning and design work, and a portion of that is dedicated to the assessment.
Okay.
So I don't have that off the top of my head.
Okay, so, but the alternatives is not necessarily baked into that planning work?
The assessment of alternatives is, and to identify if, before we make a final
Right.
plan and design,
Okay.
it is built into that, but it is not built into the budget right now.
And-
It is the actual work to conclude the work is not built into it.
Gotcha.
Based on our preliminary assessment, we didn't feel we could afford it.
Yeah.
But if that were something that were necessary, it would certainly be our Plan A.
Okay.
Sort of line.
Well, I'm gonna switch subjects. Is that okay?
That's allowed.
All right, it's allowed, okay. I'm going back to, bringing students in and maintaining students in the institution. And I know CCV has a very aggressive program now with free tuition. And I know that you've also been the benefit of having, students with a free ride, so to speak. They've had their tuition paid, and we had a lot to do with that in here. And that's been successful in building workforce in different areas. So are you thinking about how to expand the free tuition without putting a huge burden on the state or on you? Have you thought about that?
Yes, so, I think you're right, the critical occupation scholarship, tuition advantage, 802 opportunity has shown us that, this notion that students are really concerned about paying for college, and when we can take that burden off of them, they come and they are retained, which is really important. So it's not even so much getting them in the front door, it's making sure that they're retained and that they go to graduation, so that we have, lots of nurses as an example. The piece of this for me, as I have looked at it over the last year and talked to folks, is really fundamentally the 802 opportunity grants that have been directed to CCD through BSAC. The thing that they do is they make it affordable and easy to understand. So a lot of times we create programs to make one sector or another work well, which is fantastic, and they are successful, but if we have an opportunity to make a program where students can really understand that I'm going to get free tuition, we believe, given the extreme success of the 802 opportunity grant, that's the best way to go. So one of the things you will see in here is BSAC this year is looking to try to see how we might be able to expand that 802 opportunity grant also to VTSU. Because right now, and you've probably all heard the commercials on TV, you know, if your family makes $75,000 or less, you can go to CCV for free. That's the message. That's the message that I would like to have throughout the whole system. One of the reasons for the income caps, you may be asking, well, why not everybody get a free tuition? And certainly I would love that and would hope someday we could do that. But we do have to think of our fiscal responsibilities. And so saying 75,000 or even your family makes 100,000, you can go for free. I think it allows us as Vermonters to say we are helping folks that need that help the most, and we're also being fiscally responsible. So broadly speaking, it's around $5 million probably to expand this program into VTSU. So the numbers aren't so out of the realm of possibility for the legislature, and it would just impact so many students. So last year alone, there were 26,000 students who took advantage of that 802 opportunity grant. I mean, it's a lot of people. And right now, that's about 60% of the students that are going to CCV. So 60% of the students to CCV are going tuition free because of that 802 opportunity grant. I mean, it's just amazing. And we've seen the enrollment numbers go up. We've seen our completion numbers go up, so we know it works. So if I had to say it, I would say expand this to VTSU and expand it on an income band as well. That will make the legislature, not bankrupt all of us, but also will allow us to see how it works or something like that.
Okay, I'm gonna think, I'll have to think about that. I mean, it's compelling to think that it might work and what could happen.
We have the data that's showing that
Yeah.
it's doing what I think we would want a program like that to do, increase the numbers and then increase the completion rates.
So one of the things that we very much noticed, and you pointed it out, and that it's consistent with national statistics, which is that students are not thinking about necessarily their student loan debt. They're thinking about, how do I pay next semester's tuition? How do I make my car payment? How do I pay my rent? How do I eat?
Right.
And those programs that you were able to fund through COVID dollars and the 802 Opportunity Scholarship take away that concern. And what it has done for us is not only get students into the chairs in the classrooms, but as Chancellor Mack notes, it's getting them to the finish line. What we want them to do is get to a meaningful credential so that they're able to move into the workforce, take a higher skilled job, be able to feed their families more effectively, be able to do different things in the environment. And we're seeing that that's a direct connection, and it's very, very closely aligned with national norms, which is that individuals want to work and learn, they're older, and they want to have lives. And those are things that are very, very true for here.
Two questions on the connection between UVM. So UVM has their Promise Scholarship, which is similar, but it's $100,000. And you have to get it in UVM, right? So is there any talk about trying to align those? So I don't know if that.
Certainly, we picked the $75,000 band just because that's what 802 Opportunity currently is. I do believe in the governor's recommend, he actually had increased it for CCD to $100,000 a year. The bands of funds, just so you can understand the numbers, if we went 50,000, it'd be about $2 million, and for maybe only some programs. If we went to $100,000 for everybody at VTSU, and again, assuming the CCV piece is already in place, it's just under $7 million. So those are the kinds of numbers we're looking at. So if we wanted to sort of make it equal for all students, CCV, VTSU, and UVM, you're probably looking for VTSU at about $7 million.
So, and I just want to clarify just one thing, which is that the University of Vermont's program is exceptional and it is self-funded. They are, that is how they're directing their resources. With 80% of our students being Vermonters, it would be exceptionally difficult for us to do that inside of our budget.
Right.
It's not possible for us.
What is the CCV tuition advantage? Like, is that a separate program just for CCV students?
It's just CCV students, and it's for very specific programs that are trade stays.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
they're
that
very
was
specific programs.
specific to the jobs that we need, like the nursing and things like that.
Correct. It's done in consultation with the Department of Labor,
Right.
and specific programs that may change from year to year.
Okay, center lines?
I have two questions. Oh, yeah, right, second, I couldn't remember the second one. But so the $5 or $7 million, that's per year?
Yes.
Or is that for the whole 4 years for the individual student? How's that?
That would be the appropriation request per year.
Per year for all the students for that 1 year, okay. And then, you don't have an endowment?
We do not
No, we do have, we do have an endowment.
That's
Yes.
the difference between you and me.
That is the
Yeah,
difference.
I want to be clear. The Vermont State Colleges does have an endowment. It's about $37 million.
Okay,
That endowment is almost exclusively directed to student aid. They are largely teachers who have retired, who have created endowments in their name, and they go directly to scholarships for students, and we give out those scholarships at ceremonies every year. I would say 99% of the proceeds are directed to student scholarships, and the remaining is to professional development.
And is that managed within the chancellor's office?
It is managed at the chancellor's office with an outside advisor and the board of trustees.
thank you.
Any other questions for the chancellor? It's your only time to say chancellor. We don't have any other chancellors. Ever. You're the only one. Thank you, chancellor.
Thank you. Thank you, we appreciate it.
Thank you.
Everybody's outside. Well, she'll see the movement.
And you'll see the movement and then you'll know.
They're out there.
Emily,
Are you taking a break or am I
no, you're
right into it?
We took a break right before this.
They were all broke up.
All right,
Close while you're here.
why am I here? Elle, did you send me the link? Is it in the?
Yeah, it's in the thing, okay. So for the record, Emily Byrne from the Joint Fiscal Office. I have put together a presentation that I've been giving at a couple different places around federal funds in the state budget. That Senator Perchuk asked me to give here today. I'm not gonna spend, it's a pretty quick presentation. And then after that, Amy mentioned there may be interest in knowing where on the website to find the BAA documents, so I can do that. And then I have a quick presentation that's sort of like Appropriator 101, how to talk about carry forward reversions and stuff. That's a little like light and fun for a Friday
Does it
afternoon.
involve Chris?
It does involve Chris,
Okay.
which is why he's here.
And this is timely because in their presentation, they talked about their federal funds and how a chunk of those has been suspended. This has happened at other agencies in the state where they go to the federal portal where they would normally draw down the funds, and it either says suspended or it's just not there. And they don't really have any more information than that of what's going to happen next. We're hoping that the courts straighten that out, but what Emily will provide is more statewide kind of the breadth of federal funds and for state budgeting.
Yeah, and just generally, yeah, where the money is, how it gets spent currently. So yeah, overview of federal funds in the state budget. So the state budget itself is 36% federally funded, and 64% state funded. That does not represent all of the federal funds that flow into the state of Vermont or that go to higher education institutions or municipalities or nonprofits or other entities across the state. This is just what flows through state agencies and departments and is appropriated by the General Assembly and sort of through the, is authorizing state government to spend. We've shown this slide a few times in a few different places, but this is a sort of high level overview based on the sort of area of government of where federal funds are. So, the bigger the blue bar, the more federal dollars that are running into that section of government. And then similarly, looking at like the percentage of the total bar that is federal funds is a good sort of indicator of how much that area of government relies on federal funding. You can see there's a lot in the Medicaid program. It's about
more than half federally funded, and in the transportation space, more than half of the funds come from the federal government, and sort of sprinkled throughout the rest of state government. The K through 12 education, the reason that one is so big and so much state funds is it does include the state payment to school districts. But there's actually a lot of federal funds that support the agency of education and that also run to school districts through grants. This is just another way of slicing the chart that you saw on the last slide. And this, some people are better with pictures, some people do better with charts. This is a sort of chart form, and this shows, you know, with total percentages, just the percent of total spending, how much is federal funds in this, right? As I just said, Medicaid is 60%. The Department of Labor, which is hard to see on those little lines because the amount as it compares to the rest of the appropriations in state government is so small, but the Department of Labor, mostly the unemployment insurance that comes from the federal government is over 63% federally funded. And then Commerce gets a lot of federal funds through HUD and other CBGG grants. Natural Resources, over 50%, mostly at DEC, and Transportation, as I said, is over 50% federally funded.
And this, again, like higher ed, looks like it's zero, but we know the feds give them funds directly.
Directly, correct. They don't pass through state government. So at a high level, when it comes to federal funds, there are a lot of requirements that come with them. So there are things like matching requirements. So for Medicaid, for example, we talk a lot about the FMAP, the Federal Medical Assistance Percentage. That's how much the federal government, their cost share, if you will, of the Medicaid program. And lots of other programs, there are match requirements in the transportation area, where 80% of a project will be the federal funds and 20% state funds. The thing with the federal Medicaid match, why that one gets a lot of attention, is that changes year over year, and it's sort of funded nationally depending on sort of how your state economy compares to other state economies and how your demographics compare to other state demographics. Nobody gets less than 50% match. Vermont is, I think, in about 56%, but that moves kind of how the economy nationally is tracking and how Vermont tracks against that. So that one you'll often see changes in the ups and downs related to how the FMAP is projected to change over time. There's also this thing called maintenance of effort. So a lot of times when the federal government gives the states monies, you have to continue to provide the services that you were providing prior to when the federal funds came through, and you have to keep doing that over time. And there's often a check back with the federal government to make sure that you know, if you're providing a certain level of special education services to students, that you continue to provide that level as the federal dollars come in, and you're not chipping away at it. And sort of a similar issue, not exactly the same as this idea of supplement versus supplant. So often federal funds are given to states not in lieu of state dollars that are already being spent on a similar program. They're supposed to be in addition to what's being spent. So you have to demonstrate often to the federal government that you're not reducing your state spending or that you're not supplanting those federal dollars with state dollars. And all federal funds require an approval and acceptance by the Joint Fiscal Committee per statute, or by the General Assembly when the General Assembly is in session. But that process, anytime there's new grants, it's done by the CFBA number, which is how the federal government tags all of the grants. Any new funds have to go through the Joint Fiscal Committee. Any grants that are sort of like ongoing year to year, once they're approved the first time, they don't have to get reapproved every year. They keep getting approved. I should note that federal funding, you know, a lot of it goes out in grants and contracts. So the school districts or nonprofits, or to medical providers, but it also supports, you know, the salaries and benefits of state employees and some of the operations of state government. The people that are implementing all of those programs are federally funded. And similarly, the federal government recognizes that to operate a state government, you have to have a Department of Human Resources and an accounting system and sort of buildings and that overhead piece. And through the internal service funds, the state is able to charge those federal grants for its sort of fair share, if you will, of state operations. So there's also federal funds kind of underlying a lot of those sort of operational departments, if you will.
Sarah Watson?
Yeah, I realize it's kind of a newbie kind of question, but why do the grants have to be approved? Like, it's money that's coming to us,
Mhm.
and we could be like, nope, send it back. Is that,
Yeah,
okay, so yeah, what's the logic there?
so the logic there is really, and this is the PowerPoint that I'm gonna do afterwards, but it's the sort of power of the purse logic, where the General Assembly is the only one that can authorize the executive branch to spend funds.
Mhm.
So if the executive branch is given funds, the General Assembly has to be the one that says like, yes, go forward and do that thing.
And sometimes
That check and balance.
there's often a match part component too, and then also, I don't know if there's ever been one that's been denied, at least not in my short term time on the committee, but I'm sure there's an example at some point, but the example that was given to me, there might be a grant that's gonna set us up for some expenses, because you're gonna set up a whole program, you're gonna hire 14 people, and then,
And
are
then
you
it
really gonna
ends,
shut
and
that?
then what do you do?
Yeah, are you really gonna shut it down, or like, is there
Yeah.
danger of having to keep that expense going?
Okay.
Yeah, I think that comes, especially with new ones, that comes up a lot, because once you're doing the thing, and the federal government says, we're not gonna do a thing anymore.
Yeah, right.
So what Jane used to say, though, yeah, people would come to her and say like, oh my God, you have to fund this because we're gonna lose 14 positions. You don't want us to fire 14 people. And she's like, well, this was grant funded. We never promised any state money.
Right.
You should have prepared for that.
Right.
So at a high level, the next bunch of slides, I'm not gonna go through all of them in detail, but this breaks down, the appropriations. The initial slide was sort of that big sort of area of government. This breaks it down to the departments within those areas of government, just to give a little bit more granular detail in terms of who this money is flowing to. Right, so in the protection area, right, there's a significant running to the military, which you wouldn't expect through the National Guard, but then, you know, the Center for Crime Victim Services, Agency of Agriculture, a pretty significant amount of federal funds, and public safety through Homeland Security and FEMA funds running through them. Secretary of State's office is more like elections related funding. And then the Agency of Human Services obviously is where a lot of significant amount of federal funds are running. Often when I give this presentation, people ask, how come it's such a small amount of federal funds in the Department of Vermont Health Access and the Department of Mental Health and Dale? And that's because those departments get their funding through, their federal funding runs through Global Commitment. So that Global Commitment match, the second line down, the $1.2 billion, that's the federal funds that then get redistributed back out to the agencies and departments within the Agency of Human Services. So it's the mixing bowl, as it gets called. So that's not the federal funds that are listed for those departments are the money that is not Global Commitment, that runs directly to those departments. And then the Global Commitment match comes through separately. So keep going from there. This one breaks down Agency of Natural Resources. So most of the federal funds are running through the Department of Environmental Conservation, through the EPA, and other entities, and then Commerce and Community Development, as I mentioned, you know, money for, and the HCP gets a significant amount of federal funds through things like the CBDG grant and HUD money. These are the appropriations that it didn't make sense to break down into their own slide because they're sort of one-off departments. They're sort of one for one. In the Agency of Administration, the only federal funds go to the Department of Libraries to get distributed to municipalities. Again, I mentioned the Department of Labor earlier, the unemployment program being a big chunk of those funds. The Agency of Education, I did a little bit of tweak. If the second slide, if you remember, that number was very big. Total spending in education is close to $3 billion. When you exclude the education payment and the contribution to the state teachers retirement fund, so if you just look at sort of the operations of the agency and the grants that the agency puts out, about 90% of those funds, 90% of those costs are federally funded.
Yeah. It'd be hard when the agency's
It's
gone.
gonna be awful when it's gone,
And that's the state agency of it. And then the Agency of Transportation, as we talked about, a little over 2/3, about 2/3 federally funded. So that's the sort of like general high-level overview of federal funds running through the state budget. The federal funds information for the states is a really good resource. Marcia Howard, who often comes to the all-member briefing that we do in December. This is the organization that she works for, and there's lots of good information on that, all different types of federal grants and how much Vermont gets, and a lot of good information there. So if you wanted to do some reading while it's snowing this weekend, this is a fun place to look. Should you want to. So that's a really high level federal funds. I don't know if there's other questions or thoughts I can answer right now or at any other time. I can move on to the next part 2.
We're eagerly waiting part 2.
Great. All right. I can't remember what I said part 2 is going to be. Part 2 is going to be looking at the JFO website.
And BAA.
How
to speak like an appropriator.
That's going to be next.
Oh, wow.
That's not part 2?
Do you want me to do how to speak like an appropriator is part 2, or how to find BAA documents is part 2?
Speak like an appropriator.
Okay, I can totally do
Then
that.
we'll-
There's no test on this, is there?
All right. If we pass
See,
the
read
budget,
it.
pass the test.
Yeah, there you go.
Then you pass it.
Preferably before.
That's not the same thing.
Oh, I'm sorry. Try that one.
Right, if I do this one.
It says budget definitions.
Yeah,
It's the second one, it says budget definitions,
Says-
part 1.
Part 1. I haven't written part 2 yet. It's sort of like the original history of the world.
Yeah.
Oh, that's just the second slide.
How to speak like an
Never
appropriator.
mind, thank you, you're catching up,
Are you a newbie on that?
apparently.
Ways to go.
Yeah, me too.
All right, so we thought it would be good to put together, I haven't put together any other of these presentations, but we're gonna have a series of presentations that I think will be helpful for appropriators in terms of just like the terminology that gets thrown around that non-state financial people don't always know what those are. Let's try to distill it down because there's a lot of new people on this committee, a lot of new people on the House committee. So this is just a like high level, how to speak like an appropriator. Finance terms can sometimes feel like another language. So there's a lot of terms that get tossed around by the experts. And the definitions aren't always obvious. And then sometimes we miscommunicate with each other because you think you're talking about carry forward, but you're really talking about a direct app or whatever it is. So this is trying to go into some of those technical terms that have very specific definitions, and that if we use the wrong language, we accidentally do the wrong thing or, you know, miss things. So what we're going to talk about today is spending authority, appropriation, carry forward, and reversion.
What about rescissions?
We're not going to talk about rescissions today. I'll put it on the list of things.
What
to
if I
talk
ask you
about.
a question about it?
You can ask
Are we
me.
talking about it?
What?
What if I ask you a question, then we'd be forced to stop?
I would be, right, okay, so maybe I will talk about rescissions. I only plan to come in to talk about spending, but
I
I'm
might
happy.
surprise you with a few others.
Great. So that's what we're gonna start today. I know Deputy Commissioner Merrill was in a couple days ago talking about this specifically, so that probably should have come in before him, but maybe some of what he talked about will make more sense. So the first one is sort of spending authority versus appropriation. So the spending authority, as we're talking about, right? Like the General Assembly, through the power of the purse, or constitutionally, is the only one that can authorize a specific entity of government to spend a specific amount of money from a specific fund. So in that like entity of government, right, we mostly talk about it in terms of the executive branch, but the same thing applies to the other 2 branches of government, right? So the General Assembly authorizes the judiciary to spend money, and you authorize yourself to spend money in the next fiscal year. An appropriation is really just a sort of like formal term of that action, right? Of the granting of a spending authority, sort of encompasses this idea that it's a specific amount from a specific fund to an entity. So an example of an appropriation, I give Chris $5 to buy me a cup of coffee. I've given him the authority to spend a certain amount of funds for a specific purpose. That's an appropriation. And so there's this difference between appropriated versus obligated. This came up a lot with the ARPA funds, and that this idea of appropriations establishes that spending authority. It doesn't commit the funds to that specific grant or the specific contract. When an agency or department comes in and testifies, they're telling you what they plan to do with the appropriation. And there can be deviations from that plan, and those are presented in the Budget Adjustment Act, to sort of realign the plan with the spending authority that's been authorized. When the entity goes to execute that plan, they begin to obligate the money. So that can happen when they execute a contract that obligates a piece of that spending authority. When they run payroll every 2 weeks, that obligates those funds for that specific payroll. When they buy pens or computers for the agency or department, that's the sort of obligation. It has to be an actual, like, we're gonna do the thing in a transaction that happens. So in the appropriation and the obligation, there's no actual changing, money's not changing hands in either of those things. The expense part of this occurs once the payment has actually been made. So, right, you run payroll, but once checks actually go out to employees, that's when the expense happens. You give an invoice to a contractor or a subrecipient of a grant, that's when the expense occurs. When you write a contract or a grant and make that obligation, you reduce the spending authority available because you said, okay, we've got $1 million and we're gonna write a $10,000 contract to somebody. That obligation has been made, you anticipate you're gonna spend that $10,000 on that thing. Or you actually put the money out the door, and that reduces how much spending authority you have available for the remainder of the fiscal year. So, an example of this, I give Chris the same $5 to buy me a cup of coffee. When Chris fills up the mug, he's obligated to pay somebody for that cup of coffee. That's the obligation, that's the sort of obligating event, right? The expense occurs when he hands the actual cash to the cashier. So I give him the $5, that is his spending authority, then he fills up the cup, then he's obligated to pay for it, and then he gives the money to the cashier, that's the expense. So carry forward. Often an entity doesn't obligate or expend exactly what's been appropriated, right? The budget's a plan, it's based on a set of assumptions. We think we have these employees and their payroll is going to be X, and then somebody retires or they get sick or whatever, and the payroll is different than you thought it was gonna be about the budget. When that happens, the entity will find itself with some spending authority at the end of the fiscal year that hasn't been obligated. And what happens with that spending authority depends on the fund from which that appropriation originated. So, if the spending authority is from a special fund, a federal fund, interdepartmental transfers, or the internal service funds, and they haven't used it, the spending authority disappears at the end of the fiscal year. Unless there's explicit language that rolls the spending authority forward. So in language, there's often like the Clean Water Fund will carry forward appropriations. I think they added the Technology Computer Modernization Fund will roll forward, going forward.
Clean Energy Development Fund.
Oh, that one, yeah, that might be it. Sometimes it's in statute, sometimes it's in session law, like capital bill, those are spending authorities always roll forward. So the spending authority from those funds, it's either reestablished in the appropriations process, right? You start a new fiscal year, you get a new appropriation from that special fund. It's reestablished in law, either through the budget adjustment or whatever, or it's reestablished through the excess receipts process, which the excess receipts process is even further in the weeds, and we're not going to really talk about that today. But that's a delegation of authority to the Commissioner of Finance and Management to allow him to give a department ability to spend from a special fund if more receipts are to come in, for example. So spending authority that does carry forward, the spending authority from the general fund, the transportation fund, the TIB fund, Transportation Infrastructure Bond Fund, the Education Fund, Technology Modernization Special Fund, or the Clean Water Fund. Historically, the spending authority in the budget is given, I think, in the budget adjustment that says that spending authority carries forward subject to approval of the Secretary of Administration, who gets to decide whether or not that carry forward, that spending authority lives for another fiscal year, or if it gets reverted in the budget adjustment process. For the judiciary and the legislative branches who get appropriations from the general fund, that automatically also carries forward, but because of the separation of powers, the Secretary of Administration has no say over whether or not, what the judiciary and the legislature do with their carry forward funds.
But the Secretary of Administration basically, he has the approval to carry it to the legislature. So that's why we see their carry forward reversions in their proposal.
Yes, and usually it's because the legislature has said, you can take this. We are good with reverting that money.
So, could you give me an example, so I keep these people here all weekend?
Yeah.
When would the legislature have the ability to carry forward? Where would those monies come from?
So if they're, same way that they would be generated in sort of any other agency or department. So we have to make an estimate on what per diems are gonna be claimed from year to year. And not everybody, we don't know who's gonna claim housing versus mileage or how much will get claimed, and not everybody claims everything and all that kind of stuff, so there may be money generated. Similarly, there may be vacancy savings in the legislative branch, right? We plan to have this many people at joint fiscal and we have an empty position, or ledge council. Or there's, joint fiscal has grants and contracts, right? Like maybe one doesn't happen, or we spend less in 1 year than we thought we were gonna spend. Something like
I guess I was confused with how we appropriate money to ourselves. And
that. Yeah. So this is the language that's in the budget adjustment process. So this says, with notwithstanding of the provision, money from spending authority from these funds will carry forward into the next fiscal year, and designated for expenditure. So if an entity has unobligated or unexpended spending authority at the end of the fiscal year, it's brought forward into the next fiscal year. It can be, yes. The Secretary of Administration can say, which is when we go through the budget adjustment, you will see there is this very long list of reversions this fiscal year. So often why you have carry forward, there's, timing issues, right? Like an invoice comes in for a contract on June 28th and you don't obligate it or pay it out, and you need to carry those funds forward to the next fiscal year so you can meet that obligation. Often there's pay act obligations that need to get dealt with. And so sometimes when I worked the executive branch, you would carry forward funds to make sure we had enough to meet the anticipated pay act needs. And yeah, a lot of times it's just timing issues that you need money to carry forward so that you can meet prior year obligations. So the example of carry forward, we're gonna go back to I give Chris buying me coffee. Oh, and I forgot to disclaim this at the beginning. I don't ask staff to buy me coffee. That's not like an appropriate. This is just for example purposes. It's never, and Chris is here mostly to vouch for the fact I've never asked him to buy me coffee. It's true, it could be a different Chris.
I do like that you gave him the money.
I gave him the money, yeah, but I've never, hey, go run my errands for me, please, Chris. So anyway, I give Chris $5 to buy me the cup of coffee. The cafeteria coffee only cost me $1.59. I tell Chris to keep the change and buy me a cup of coffee tomorrow. The funds haven't been obligated, right? There's that $3.41 or whatever that's not obligated. But Chris has directions to carry it forward for a specific purpose for a known future expenditure. Buy me the cup of coffee tomorrow. That's what carry forward is, in a nutshell. So the last piece of this is reversions. So if a department has funds that aren't obligated or expended, and it's determined that the spending authority isn't needed, right? There isn't a grant or a contract or some sort of activity that the timing didn't work within the 12-month fiscal year. The Secretary of Administration or the legislature or the judiciary can decide to revert that spending authority back to the general fund. Sometimes there are some in the big bill, but mostly in the Budget Adjustment Act. And so through that reversion process, the money that backed that original appropriation that was set aside for that thing is available to get appropriated again. So we think about it sort of like was taken out of the pond for a specific purpose. We release it and drop it back into the general pond to be reappropriated.
So you'll remember the 14 million out of the 20 million that was appropriated to the treasurer for paying down bonds. where would that fall under an obligation to revert? Or is there no obligation to revert?
There's no obligation to revert. Because so that appropriation was in 2022, I believe, it automatically carries forward for the language that says everything carries forward. This one's a little tricky because it actually got pulled by the emergency board. And so really what happens is sort of the conversation with the Secretary of Administration and with the legislature is like, you appropriated for this specific purpose, here's the language around it, and that no longer applies or is not.
So in other words, if we appropriate money to the treasurer, and the treasurer doesn't use it, he can just hang on to it indefinitely.
Yes, but he could only use it for the specific purpose outlined in statute.
I'm just wondering, is it because he falls under the executive branch, right? So how is it,
Different from the other fund.
when you say then the spending authority is reverted, you don't mean automatically, you mean that the administration chooses to revert it?
Yes. Yeah, so through that conversation, so the Secretary of Administration has the sort of has the authority to say, yes, carry it forward for that purpose, or we're gonna revert it. So presumably in those conversations about what would get carried forward or not, are sort of determined, let's leave it in that initial appropriation to be carried forward for its purpose. And then since then, more conversation, more information is available that maybe carrying it forward for that purpose isn't necessary anymore.
And could we revert it, even if they didn't propose, right? So even the Secretary of Administration says, go ahead, carry it forward. But we're like, hey, we know that money's there, we're gonna revert it.
Yeah, I think that's within your
Because
authority.
that's, to your point, that's essentially what the House has done. They've said, we want to use that money, but they did it by way of a conversation with the treasurer, and he's agreed to that use of the money, but it could have been done without the conversation, just, okay. And by the way, there's still 6 million sitting there, so I haven't forgotten about that.
Yeah. So, last example related to the coffee, I've given Chris the $5, I've given you like $5 each time. It costs $1.59. I tell Chris I want my change back. Now I have my $3.41 back in my possession. I can give it to somebody else to buy me coffee tomorrow, or I can do something completely different with it. And that's the sort of reversion. Give you back my change is the reversion process, basically.
Yes, otherwise.
So, but just to be clear, that money gets reverted back to whatever fund it came from.
Yes.
If you're gonna revert it.
You can't revert it to me, it has to go back to you.
Yes, yes, it has to go back to its original fund. So if you were to revert education fund, it stays in the education fund.
Right.
You'd have to that would be a whole other.
Everything doesn't
step.
not automatically, if you're gonna revert it, it doesn't necessarily go back to the general fund. It could, but.
Yes, if it's a general fund appropriation,
Right,
it goes back to the general fund. If it's a clean water fund appropriation, it goes back to the clean water fund.
And then we could move it from there if we want.
You can move it from there if you want to, yeah.
I don't think that looks like $1.59 cup of coffee.
I was gonna say.
The first one did.
That's fair.
And then, so my example, because that's your last slide, right? Or is the end one?
Yes.
Is the rescission, which in the discussion of the federal funds, I think is important that we talk about what a rescission is, because if the feds really were to continue to hold all that money, we would get to a point where we would run into a problem and we would have to do some rescission.
Yeah, possibly.
Or obligated?
Possibly.
Well, we could, but like, yeah, I guess if they had the spending authority for all the staff are paid by federal funds, the federal funds don't come, we would have to rescind that obligation, because then they would have to use state funds, and we don't want them to use state funds for all that. We would say, we would do a rescission, which is pulling back the obligation. So in your example, a rescission would be, you gave Chris $5, before he bought the coffee, you said like, no, wait, I want my $5 back. don't buy the coffee. Even if you bought the coffee, you could rescind.
If he already bought the coffee, we'd be in a more complicated
But
situation.
is that the situation we're in with the federal funds right now? With some of this money, we have spent it, we're waiting for, reimbursement. The feds have kind of put it on ice, and we don't know if we assume we're gonna get it. If, the court straightened it out, but if we don't, we would have to kind of rescind money the money that Chris already spent.
It's a little more nuanced, complicated. I'll try to figure out how to say this simply. So a rescission only applies to spending authority, right? So if the General Assembly had to go through a rescission process, and I'll go back to 10 years ago when Amy and I were in finance and management, when we were in a very different financial situation and we were talking about cutting, $100 million out of the general fund due to a revenue downgrade, right? So that was, no obligations had really been made, no expenses had been incurred. That was like, we plan to spend this much and we're going to adjust the plan, we're going to pull the plan back. So a rescission for the federal funds is sort of the same situation, right? We planned to spend these federal funds. The federal government has said you're not going to get that money, so now you got to change your plan. With what's going on right now, again, I think the courts are what happens with the courts, but we are paying people and meeting obligations and the sort of legal obligation for the federal government to reimburse states that have incurred costs under contracts or grants that are legally binding obligations, I think is what's going to get figured out. And I'm not a lawyer, so I don't want to get too far out of over my skis and any of that.
Yeah.
But that is a sort of different conversation. If we don't get paid for the stuff that we're doing right now, that we have, obligation with the federal government to do, versus if in the future they say, we're not going to give you money for that thing anymore. That's sort of like two different problems. That would get dealt with two different ways.
But we wouldn't likely to do a rescission in FY26. We're not doing one for the VA, actually, but you would do it in FY26 unless we had a downgrade by the economist, or something drastic like the Fed pulled back $600 million.
Yeah, and I think the rescission process occurs when the General Assembly is not in session. So if there's her current statute, right, because you're in session, you would react to it accordingly in the budget or through another budget adjustment type, or through the Budget Adjustment Act. In the future, if it's when you're out of session, then there's statutory authority to the Joint Fiscal Committee. If there's a reduction of a certain amount, Joint Fiscal Committee gets to make decisions about how much to pull back versus, and then if it's more than a certain amount, then the General Assembly has to adopt a reduction plan.
All right, thanks.
Yeah.
Any questions about speaking like an appropriator?
You want me to show you the website where
Yeah.
the VA stuff?
So I asked Emily to do this because the House passed the Budget Adjustment Act.
Third reading?
Was that yesterday?
Third
reading today. And I assume I don't know if it was another roll call, but so it's passed. So that means we're going to get it on Tuesday, or it's Tuesday to carry the stay over day. And then we get it on Wednesday. Travels on Tuesday, we get it on Wednesday?
Yeah, unless they message, but
yeah,
probably.
So, but we've already started on it, so it's not like we have to wait to get possession of it to work on it. I talked a little bit about maybe trying to get our vote out by next Friday. We don't have to do it that quick, but we couldn't do it that quick because we talked a lot about the main proposals, but we're gonna hear next week from the chair of the House committee that will talk about what they've done. Emily's going to give us a more detailed walkthrough of the changes. We won't walk through the whole bill because we've already done that, but we'll focus on the changes. And then there'll be any changes that the Senate committee wants to make. So, and that's something we haven't really discussed. I've told some of you some of the things I'm thinking about were on like flood recovery. We talked about the Human Rights Commissions. The AG came in, so we have to make those decisions next week, and if there's anything else that we have. So I thought if you wanted to, in addition to reading the financial reports on per capita by other states, you could look at what the House did. So Emily's just gonna show us really quick
Sure.
where you could look at the.
Best place to find sort of everything summarized, the high level stuff, joint fiscal office website. Go to subjects, appropriations and budget. FY 2025, this is 25 budget adjustment. And then right at the top are House documents. And then after that, if you want.
And are the highlights just the changes?
The highlights are,
So that was.
yes, the highlights are the sort of the overview, the high level summary.
And there was no amendments, or no amendments passed?
No amendments at all.
Were amendments offered? No, okay.
The web report is up there. Those of you who have been through this before might remember the web report, but the web report is an annotated, here's what the governor proposed, here's the change that the House made. And then when the Senate makes changes, we're gonna add a column that has the Senate changes in the total. And then where the House make changes, there are explanations. So you can see what the House did.
The explanations on the web report are very brief.
Are very brief and very general, yeah. And then on the one-times, I can show you. One-time stuff, it shows, this is what the governor recommended and this is what the House changed. For the one-time appropriations, what else is out there?
And then there's the whole language, but that's hard to.
The language will be it does have a link to the introduced, so it's H-141 is the bill number. Obviously it says that 6 times on here, but if you want to read 141 is another good place to look.
I would find it's hard to read it in the language and know really what the House did compared to what the governor, because it doesn't say in there when you're reading the bill.
Right. And when Grady comes and walks through the bill, he can do some of those, show some of those differences. There's links to the giant.
Right, so where is that spreadsheet?
That one is called the budget adjustment summary, so it's the third one listed. And so this one.
I'd say for the committee, that budget adjustment summary spreadsheet is kind of one of the main documents that we will use to track what were changes, and then because it makes sure that the bottom line that we're balanced.
And this one I will probably walk through early next week.
So we're gonna have Emily walk through, we're gonna have Grady walk through the language, we're gonna have the Representative Shy walk through what they did. And then we could hear other testimony if you wanna hear, if there's something that they did that you wanna know more about from another source, then we can do that. Or if there's anything new that you want to talk about, we can do that. So there's something to think about as we go into. Any questions, comments? Praise for the chair?
You did a great job.
I'll get back to you on that.